These haunting words belong to a former FBI special agent, spoken on the record over 5 agonizing weeks into the desperate hunt for Nancy Guthrie. And his chilling assessment elevated this entire mystery into much darker territory, suggesting that the primary target of public fixation, that faceless, masked phantom captured on the doorbell lens, might actually be the least significant player in this twisted game. The theory points a glaring spotlight at an insider, a shadow lurking within Nancy's own inner circle, someone armed with the exact knowledge of her whereabouts, the precise moment she would be isolated, and the hidden mechanics of her home security. Yet, whose shadow is it, and what is the motive? When a retired federal agent, a veteran shaped by more than 2 decades of grueling, high-stakes government investigations, steps into the public arena to make such an audacious, calculated claim about the exact type of person who orchestrated this vanishing act, you can be absolutely certain he detected subtle anomalies that an ordinary observer would completely overlook. He offered no specific names. He refused to point a definitive finger for the cameras. Instead, what he deliberately and methodically constructed was a psychological profile, a very distinct, dangerous category of human being. And before we unmask who precisely fits inside that chilling mold, we must first peel back the layers of discrepancies that forged his absolute certainty. These discrepancies were not born from idle gossip. They were hardwired into the timeline. And I must be crystal clear right now. This analysis does not exist to hurl accusations. The entire Guthrie family, encompassing all spouses, was formally and officially cleared by Sheriff Nanos on February 16, 2026. That official exoneration remains absolute, and nothing presented here is an attempt to dispute it. Rather, our objective is to meticulously follow the breadcrumb trail laid out by a credentialed federal expert, revealing exactly where that framework guides us when overlaid onto the stark reality of the public record. That is not an indictment. It is cold, clinical analysis. So, we must retreat to the chilling, bitter night of January 31st. This is where Rogers's psychological blueprint takes root, and where one individual's placement on the chronological map becomes profoundly difficult to brush aside. Rogers isolated 3 highly specific pillars of intimate knowledge that were undoubtedly funneled to the kidnapper: the home's defensive grid, Guthrie's private daily routine, and her hidden physical frailties. Let us filter each of these pillars through the known facts and watch the silhouette form. We begin with the security apparatus. The masked phantom who slinked up to Nancy Guthrie's porch in the dead, early hours of February, first showed zero hesitation when confronting the camera. He locked onto it immediately, smothering the glassy lens with a heavy, gloved palm, before utilizing a nearby piece of foliage to completely blind the device. He recognized the camera as the primary threat, arriving armed with a calculated strategy to defeat it. A random predator, merely stalking the property from the shadows of the street, possesses no way of knowing if that hardware is linked to a remote cloud server. To the naked eye, the technology appears identical in either scenario. An uninitiated stranger would naturally assume the worst, that the digital eyes are beaming footage off-site, and that physically breaking the camera would not erase the crime. Yet, an individual who had actually stepped foot inside those walls, who had studied the device, grasped its exact mechanics, and knew precisely what software subscription she did or did not possess. That person would understand the video was trapped locally on the hardware. Steal the device, and the evidence vanishes into the night. It was a brilliant plan that nearly succeeded. Federal agents only managed to resurrect that ghostly footage due to fragmented, back-end data buried deep within Google's servers, a digital echo that not even the most meticulous suspect could have predicted. The shadow, who provided intel on that specific camera, possessed an uncomfortably intimate familiarity with the residents. This brings us to the schedule. This snatching was anything but random. It was executed within a razor-thin window of opportunity, only after Nancy had returned from her evening meal, only after she was comfortably settled, and only once she was entirely alone in the suffocating silence of the night. That specific time frame was selected, and it was selected flawlessly. On the evening of January 31st, Nancy Guthrie pulled up to her daughter Annie's residence at 5:32 p.m. They shared a meal. They played hands of cards. The evening stretched on comfortably. When it finally concluded, Annie's husband, Tommaso Cioni, provided the ride back to her house. 9:48 p.m. The heavy garage door groans open. 9:50 p.m. It slams shut. This exact timestamp was formally verified by Sheriff Nanos during the highly anticipated February 5th press briefing. At 9:50 p.m., that door seals the home. It is at this precise minute the timeline assumes Nancy is safely locked inside, quietly preparing for sleep. The mastermind timing this nightmare knew unequivocally that she had been away all night and had only just stepped through her door. They knew she was confined. They knew she was defenseless. They let the dark hours tick by in agonizing silence. And then, they finally struck. That breed of terrifying punctuality does not stem from staking out a property from a parked car for a long weekend. It is born strictly from existing inside the household's orbit, which leads to the final puzzle piece, her vulnerabilities. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years of age, burdened with severely restricted mobility. Sheriff Nanos stated plainly to the cameras that she could not physically manage a 50-yard walk unassisted. She is tethered to a daily regimen of crucial heart medication. Her life-saving pacemaker actively synced to her personal iPhone. By the sheriff's own grim admission, she was a woman utterly incapable of abandoning that residence of her own free will. Yet, the chilling ransom demands that materialized in the wake of her vanishing explicitly demanded attention to her vital medications. The only individuals armed with that microscopic level of medical data were the people tightly woven into her daily existence. Thus, the federal agent painted a portrait of three very specific avenues of inside intelligence: the defense system, the intimate schedule, and the hidden frailties. Now, rewind the clock and ask yourself, who possessed the master key to all three of those secrets simultaneously at 9:50 p.m. on that cold January 31st? Tommaso Cioni is a 50-year-old, Italian-born man who has rooted his life in the Arizona desert since 2006. He is the husband of Annie Guthrie, Nancy's eldest child. He makes his living teaching 6th grade science at Basis Oro Valley, and he shares a home with his wife a mere 4 miles away from where Nancy's nightmare began. No peripheral acquaintance. The son-in-law was a permanent fixture within the family dynamic, the private residence, and her daily routines. On the chilling evening of January 31st, Tommaso Cioni chauffeured the victim directly to her threshold. Watching the garage seal shut at 9:50, he possessed absolute certainty. She was safely inside and entirely alone. With Annie remaining at their residence, his situational awareness was absolute. He understood the commute, the internal layout, and the camera blind spots. Authorities never suggested he deliberately surrendered these critical details, nor is there any accusation that he foresaw their dark purpose. He remains entirely forthcoming with law enforcement, and the immediate relatives are exonerated. Yet, a haunting psychological reality persists. Federal behavioral models regarding internal threats cast light upon a highly insidious profile. Overlay the experts' critical variables, digital defenses, daily schedules, and inherent vulnerabilities with those present on January 31st. A single identity occupies the dead center. This is the exact investigative architecture laid out for authorities, beginning with a singular moment. In early March 2026, past the 5-week mark of the search, retired profiler Greg Rogers delivered a profound analysis to a national publication. His assessment was surgical. He immediately dismantled the burglary hypothesis, declaring he never viewed this tragedy as a simple theft gone wrong. The residence offered countless pristine windows of vacancy, where an intruder could have easily breached the perimeter. Professional thieves possess meticulous methodology. They study targets, strike only during absolute vacancies, and vanish within moments. Seasoned criminals refuse to gamble on invading when human presence is assured. This prompted a paradigm-shifting question. The probability is overwhelmingly high that someone acquainted with the victim through domestic upkeep, medical assistance, or landscaping was complicit. Perhaps an operative within that sphere was financially persuaded to leak reconnaissance regarding the alarm networks and her daily movements. Alternatively, an infiltrator intentionally embedded themselves within those roles expressly to harvest that high-value intelligence. Let that chilling premise sink in. Someone could have seamlessly blended into her life to map out those critical vulnerabilities. The terrifying implication being, monetary compensation was never actually required. The leak could originate from a benign figure whose access transformed them into a living dossier, an unwitting pawn inadvertently arming the predators. This model does not mandate they were the kidnapper. It dictates solely that they held the keys, and a darker entity extracted them. The categories highlighted by the expert domestic staff, nurses, and groundskeepers paint a portrait of transactional relationships dictated by a paycheck. Yet, the psychological architecture of his theory aligns with devastating precision against a far more intimate demographic. A relative with unquestioned entry. Someone anchored inside the household not by an employment contract, but through the bonds of kinship. Crucially, this theoretical matrix does not explicitly name the son-in-law, nor does it officially indict any specific individual. Instead, it isolates a specific vantage point of privileged information, challenging detectives to relentlessly hunt down the ghosts standing in that spot. While we dissected who held that access on January 31st, we must pause to weigh the profiler's credibility. This is no armchair amateur. 2 decades in federal law enforcement signifies this agent has navigated the darkest waters of a specialized, deeply sinister breed of criminality. These are meticulously engineered atrocities, fueled by resources and anchored by calculated internal manipulation. He understands how these nightmares are structured. His trained eye instantly differentiates the chaotic strike of a desperate scavenger from the chilling, logistical symphony of a precision kidnapping. He understands the subtle signatures left behind when the gateway is quietly unlocked by someone already standing inside the victim's inner circle. When a seasoned veteran analyzes the evidence and definitively deploys the term internal threat barely 5 weeks into the crisis, it transcends mere conjecture. That is cold, empirical pattern recognition from a man who devoted his career to watching these operational blueprints methodically constructed. The terrifying symmetry he identified points to an operational brilliance far surpassing anything a disconnected outsider could blindly piece together. Predators do not randomly target an 84-year-old woman residing in a secluded Tucson neighborhood without profound premeditation. They do not manifest masked under darkness, march with absolute certainty toward the digital sentry, and manually dismantle the recording device. Nor do they spirit a human being away without a flawlessly drafted schematic. That blueprint required a source, likely someone already at the victim's table. The agonizing riddle currently consuming the investigative team is no longer focused on the mere existence of an internal threat. The former agent is absolutely convinced the internal breach is factual. The true mystery lies in unmasking the informant and determining intentionality. Did blood money change hands, or was this an innocent conversationalist feeding details to a predator, unaware of the trap being laid? This psychological hypothesis is the most terrifying facet of the theory, suggesting the informant might be trapped in collateral guilt, effectively becoming a secondary casualty. At 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, the electronic eye guarding the entrance abruptly went black. By 2:12, underlying algorithms registered physical activity in the void, yet the lens remained completely blind, capturing no video. At 2:28, the digital lifeline monitoring the rhythm of her heart silently severed its connection to her smartphone. Within that suffocating, 41-minute abyss suspended between the blinding of surveillance and the quiet death of a medical signal, a life was stolen. This single revelation completely shatters our understanding of the perpetrator's blueprint. As federal agents partnered with tech giants to salvage the doorbell's digital memory, they collided with a disturbing hurdle. The physical surveillance unit had been violently ripped from its casing. Furthermore, the victim lacked a premium online storage tier. By default, these specific home monitors hoard their visual evidence strictly within the hardware. Absent that digital safety net, nothing transmits to a remote server. Steal the lens, which the intruder did, and the visual history vanishes forever. It came terrifyingly close to doing exactly that. During a media briefing on February 5th, the local sheriff bleakly admitted that external tech specialists had seemingly hit a dead end, failing to extract a single video frame. Yet, the narrative twisted days later when the Federal Bureau's director revealed a breakthrough. Ghostly echoes of data had been successfully salvaged from hidden digital vaults. Specialized programmers meticulously pieced together fragmented server whispers, microscopic code traces the perpetrator could never have anticipated leaving behind. Fate ultimately betrayed the masked phantom, though their dark calculus relied heavily on the absolute destruction of that memory. This meticulous scheme hinged on a glaring vulnerability, the absence of a remote archive. It was a deadly accurate gamble, as a random prowler outside cannot deduce a homeowner's software subscription. From the pavement, the blinking plastic eye projects the exact same illusion of security, regardless of where its data travels. An uninitiated predator operates under the paranoid assumption that every movement is beamed away. making a frontal assault far too perilous. However, a mind intimately acquainted with her specific setup, someone who had likely breathed the air inside her sanctuary, possessed chilling knowledge of her exact technological blind spots. This individual harbored the fatal secret that her digital timeline lived and died solely within that fragile shell. They understood prying the gadget from the wall was the ultimate failsafe, perfectly aware that obliterating the hardware meant erasing the truth. This represents a highly calculated, tactical level of reconnaissance, the sinister insight reserved strictly for those who have crossed the threshold of the victim's private world. Let the weight of that realization sink in. Long before the attacker ever stalked through that quiet desert community, the psychological blueprint was already drafted. They possessed the terrifying certainty that neutralizing the physical lens would guarantee their total invisibility. The assailant was unconcerned with digital safety nets, firmly secure in the fact that absconding with the device meant swallowing the sole eyewitness whole. Intimate intelligence of this magnitude is impossible to glean from a creeping vehicle. It is the absolute fingerprint of a betrayer who walked those very halls. It implies conversations over coffee, casual glances at the entryway, or explicit discussions regarding the hidden vulnerabilities of her personal fortress. The federal pursuit of those fragmented digital ghosts required agonizing days of relentless negotiation with the tech corporation's elite engineering teams, navigating the labyrinth of subpoenas and privacy hurdles merely to initiate the forensic dive underscores just how frighteningly close this plot came to absolute perfection. Had the victim purchased a slightly different equipment model, or had the server's cache purged its ghosts a fraction sooner, the visual evidence would have dissolved. The chilling silhouette haunting that front porch would have remained a localized nightmare, entirely unprovable. There would be no frozen imagery to broadcast, no subtle clues ripped from tactical gear, absolutely zero threads for detectives to unravel. The entire assault was anchored by deadly technological espionage, and it was a breath away from flawless execution. The near success was predicated entirely upon the undeniable accuracy of the informant's dark knowledge. Furthermore, the surveillance net depended exclusively on a wireless internet connection, a standard vulnerability shared by modern smart doorbells. Should that invisible digital tether be severed, the entire monitoring apparatus is instantly rendered deaf, blind, and utterly useless. A technologically savvy predator would recognize that choking the wireless signal provides a seamless corridor of invisibility, a grim hypothesis shifting our gaze toward the surrounding streets. By early March 2026, federal operatives and local county detectives began blanketing the sprawling, affluent subdivisions of the foothills. Investigators systematically marched from one manicured doorstep to the next. According to national network journalists, authorities relentlessly pressed neighbors with one highly particular inquiry. Did their home networks suffer unexplained blackouts during the midnight hours of February 1st? Numerous locals verified facing this exact line of interrogation, while detectives quietly slipped them a rather chilling piece of context. Authorities confided that a disturbing pattern of digital anomalies had already been mapped across the immediate vicinity that evening. Investigative reporters later tracked down a household sharing a property line with the victim. This adjacent estate was guarded by an overlapping grid of 4 independent electronic eyes. Curiously, the single lens pointing closest to the crime scene suffered a catastrophic memory wipe overnight on February 1st, plunging into static precisely as the abduction unfolded. The unsettled resident could only remark on the deeply sinister timing of the blackout. In a parallel revelation, a national crime correspondent exposed that yet another nearby smart camera logged a void in its archives for the exact time frame the victim was swallowed by the dark. By the 9th of March, 2026, forensic teams had pivoted their focus to a violently tampered communications pillar, located a stone's throw from the focal point of the crime. Local law enforcement explicitly acknowledged that this vandalized infrastructure is now a pivotal puzzle piece in their ongoing manhunt. Detectives officially went on the record, verifying their intense scrutiny of the shattered electrical cabinet found lurking just down the street. However, the hypothesis of a deliberate signal jamming device is far from an undisputed truth, demanding a cold, objective analysis. A seasoned former federal agent publicly dismantled the concept, highlighting the massive collateral footprint a military-grade scrambler would inevitably leave. Such a catastrophic blanket of interference, she argued, would have suffocated the victim's own digital perimeter the very second she parked her car at 9 o'clock that evening. Had a device been activated at the 50 p.m. mark, the interference with her pacemaker's delicate frequency would have been instantaneous. Yet, the digital evidence tells a different, chilling story. Neither system failed right away. The security footage from the Nest camera kept rolling, silently capturing the darkness until exactly 1:47 a.m. More disturbingly, the steady rhythm of her pacemaker maintained its transmission all the way to 2:28 a.m. Former federal investigator Jennifer Coffindaffer drew a stark conclusion from this timeline. The perpetrator either utilized an exceptionally faulty Wi-Fi blocker, or they weren't using one at all. Meanwhile, ex-FBI operative Tracy Walder maintained a more cautious stance, refusing to dismiss the presence of either a sophisticated jamming mechanism or a simple, archaic walkie-talkie. As it stands today, both terrifying possibilities remain actively on the table. Morgan Wright, who helms the National Center for Open and Unsolved Cases, injected another layer of technical reality into the mix. An ordinary, commercially available signal blocker simply lacks the sheer broadcasting power required to penetrate a neighboring residence. To successfully bleed over into adjacent properties, a radio frequency jammer would need to be a devastatingly potent piece of hardware, something akin to highly restricted military-grade equipment. Yet, one undeniable fact pierces through all the technological speculation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation viewed this digital blackout as a massive red flag, pouring unprecedented resources into conducting a sweeping, house-to-house inquiry across the entire community. Federal agents do not simply stroll down suburban sidewalks asking about dropped internet connections on a whim. That aggressive level of neighborhood canvassing points to a much darker, hidden truth. This is precisely where a pivotal observation from the National Police Association pulls the technological anomaly straight back into the unsettling realm of the insider theory. Betsy Brantner Smith, a seasoned former police sergeant acting as the voice for the National Police Association, articulated a haunting premise regarding the suspect's capabilities. She noted that if the orchestrator possessed the chilling foresight to acquire and deploy signal masking technology, the chaotic, messy scene left on the front porch simply doesn't align with that level of criminal sophistication. While the use of electronic countermeasures cannot be entirely discounted, pulling off such a stunt demands an extraordinary degree of premeditation and calculating intent. The evidence inevitably circles back to a deeply unsettling profile. A predator intimately familiar with the victim's routines. The compass keeps pointing toward a known acquaintance who stalked their prey with absolute precision. It hardly matters whether the invisible weapon was an electronic jammer, a handheld transceiver, a brute force severing of the router cables, or an unknown alternative. The fractured digital footprint surrounding Nancy Guthrie's residence on the night she was snatched off the map was absolutely, unequivocally deliberate. Federal authorities are treating this electronic void as glaring proof of a masterminded scheme. Methodical plotting implies gathered intelligence, and such intimate knowledge only flows from a specific, close-to-home source. Exactly 7 days after the victim vanished into the cold void between the night of February 7th and the pre-dawn hours of February 8th, the case took another dramatic turn. Detectives descended upon the Tucson residence belonging to Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni, plunging themselves into a meticulous, 2.5-hour deep dive inside the property. From the outside, the rhythmic, blinding bursts of forensic camera flashes painted the darkened windows as crime scene technicians meticulously documented every inch of the home's interior. When the authorities finally emerged into the night air, their hands were clad in sterile blue nitrile gloves, tightly gripping sealed brown paper bags, heavy with potential clues. Tracy Walder, leveraging her dual background in the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI, noted that the unmistakable presence of those specific bags, paired with specialized processing gear, pointed strictly toward an active physical evidence seizure. Yet, as reported by NBC News, this aggressive intrusion into their private sanctuary was entirely voluntary. Neither Annie nor Tommaso forced the detectives to present a judge's warrant before crossing the threshold. They simply stepped aside. This willing surrender of privacy was something former federal agent Jennifer Coffindaffer immediately seized upon and dissected. To her highly trained eye, the lack of a court order meant detectives possessed absolutely zero probable cause to legally implicate the couple in the crime. They merely asked, and the pair complied. Speaking directly from the trenches of federal law enforcement, she made one detail abundantly clear regarding standard operating procedures. A seasoned investigator, armed with hard, actionable, probable cause, will never rely on a suspect's polite permission to enter a dwelling. The fact that these specific raids were purely consensual speaks volumes. Boiled down to its essence, the investigative team lacked the foundational legal justification to declare them legitimate suspects. Instead, they navigated the situation through sheer voluntary cooperation. She reiterated her professional stance. An FBI operative holding the smoking gun of probable cause does not kindly ask for an invitation. This is a foundational tenet of criminal justice strategy, carrying immense weight for anyone tracking the case. Through the lens of an experienced profiler, this reliance on permission strongly implies that while authorities were hungry for forensic traces, they had not yet categorized the couple as the principal architects of the actual abduction. However, the former agent planted a deeply unsettling, lingering seed of doubt in the public's mind. Could the victim have been actively hunted? Her movements monitored the very second she pulled away from Annie and Tommaso's driveway? Was a covert beacon secretly affixed to the undercarriage in the dead of night? Did an unseen phantom physically tamper with the exterior, leaving behind nothing but latent, microscopic fingerprints for the crime lab to hunt down? The automobile in question, the exact machine belonging to Annie and Tommaso, which ferried the victim back to her doomed residence at precisely 9:48 p.m., became a massive focal point. By the fading light of February 27, 2026, that very car was swallowed by the yawning jaws of an official police impound lot. In an unyielding public statement issued to CBS 5, officials from the Pima County Sheriff's Department verified that the vehicle remained locked firmly inside their secure forensic bay. Their tight-lipped proclamation noted only that the machine remained a critical piece of the ongoing puzzle. The literal vessel that transported the victim from a warm family meal to the site of her vanishing sat under fluorescent police lights for well over 30 agonizing days. It wasn't until the crisp days of early March that the car was quietly surrendered back to its owners, right as the manhunt morphed into a grinding, marathon task force operation. Holding onto a personal automobile for over a month, long after the relatives had supposedly been absolved of direct involvement, and without a single word of public clarification, spins a dark, silent narrative of its own. It isn't explicitly a tale of familial guilt, but rather the story of a metal shell harboring a complex, invisible history that digital forensic specialists were desperately trying to decipher. An automobile is a massive, highly sophisticated reservoir of personal intelligence, far beyond what the average driver comprehends. Today's vehicles are essentially heavily armored, mobile computers tracking your every move. They silently hoard your exact geographical coordinates. They meticulously archive the digital handshakes of every single smartphone that has ever brushed against their internal Bluetooth networks. They record the exact second a passenger door swings open or clicks shut. For certain contemporary models, aggressively tracking the velocity and path of every journey is simply standard, unerasable operating procedure. A vehicle that carried the doomed woman from the safety of her daughter's sanctuary straight into the jaws of her abduction window is an absolute goldmine. It is a machine practically vibrating with hidden geographical breadcrumbs, buried communication pings, and behavioral telemetry that could blow the lid off chilling questions the outside world hasn't even begun to formulate. Coffindaffer floated the deeply paranoid yet entirely plausible theory that a clandestine GPS beacon had been magnetically slapped to its chassis. She introduced the terrifying concept to the ether, but offered no closure, and to this day, neither has anyone else. Yet, if a tracking device was secretly planted on that machine at any juncture, whether outside Annie and Tommaso's residence or parked at Nancy's estate, it dictates that an operative knew that exact automobile was designated for the drop. A shadow architect plotted their moves around it. Consider this: the feds have kept that vehicle locked down for 30+ days. Whatever dark secrets they unearthed, or glaring absences they noted, are now sealed within the investigative dossier, holding enough evidentiary weight to be impounded for over a month after the immediate relatives were officially exonerated. On the 16th of February, 2026, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos released a definitive public declaration. The entire Guthrie bloodline, every brother, sister, and spouse, which inherently included Tommaso Cioni, had been entirely eliminated as prospective suspects in the ordeal. Sheriff Nanos put it in writing, stating unequivocally that the Guthrie family, encompassing all siblings and their partners, had been completely absolved of any direct suspicion. He emphasized that the relatives had demonstrated nothing short of absolute cooperation and grace, portraying them strictly as secondary victims to this nightmare. That absolution is an irrefutable fact, etched into the public registry. This analysis is not an attempt to contradict that standing truth, yet two deeply unsettling nuances demand our immediate scrutiny. Primarily, we must look at the chronology. This blanket exoneration was handed down on February 16th. At that very moment, genetic material recovered from discarded gloves, located roughly 2 miles from Nancy's doorstep, had not been cross-referenced with any criminal registry. The grueling forensic dissection of evidence extracted from the crime scene was far from complete. Furthermore, the targeted vehicle remained firmly locked in police custody. This official pardon materialized a mere 15 days into an intricate manhunt, arriving while numerous critical scientific evaluations were still actively ticking in the background. It was issued, as the sheriff later admitted to the pressing media, simply because detectives had conducted preliminary interviews with the inner circle, confiscated their cellular devices alongside their personal computers within those frantic opening hours, and hastily sculpted a narrative derived purely from that surface-level digital sweep. Secondly, we have to dissect the exact phrasing used. The pardon strictly applied to the phrase possible suspects in this case. That is a highly specific, rigid legal classification. Translated, it merely signals that the authorities found no evidence suggesting Annie or Tommaso physically orchestrated or executed the snatching. However, it absolutely does not signify that detectives have ruled out the terrifying possibility that fragments of their daily lives, their private dialogues, or their intimate familiarity with the layout of Nancy's residence could have been weaponized by a phantom third party. Enter the insider intelligence theory posed by Rogers. This is a chilling framework where an individual is manipulated or compensated for providing logistical data, completely blind to the sinister endgame. In this scenario, the informant is never technically a suspect in the physical crime. The sole prerequisite is that they possess the keys to the castle, that they, whether through malice or sheer ignorance, morphed into the primary fountain of intelligence. The Bureau has never formally cleared a single soul under this specific paradigm, largely because this model hinges on a pawn who might remain utterly oblivious to the blood on their hands. And frankly, that is the deeply psychological facet of this mystery that ought to shatter your sleep. Forget the cinematic narrative of a greedy relative intentionally orchestrating a violent abduction of their own flesh and blood. The truth is likely far more insidious and quiet. A reality where a seemingly innocent chat or a careless sequence of observations mutated into a predator's master blueprint, where the architect handing over the keys was entirely unaware they were unlocking the door for a monster. Expert profiler Rogers has analyzed this exact breed of psychological manipulation time and time again. It explains why he deliberately highlighted that the intelligence leak might stem from someone who merely occupied a vantage point, granting them access to such highly sensitive vulnerabilities. We are talking about the passive hemorrhage of secrets, rather than active, malicious conspiracy. Picture an individual casually answering queries about Nancy's alarm system, inadvertently allowing a voyeur to glimpse what should remain hidden, or detailing her rigid weekly routines in a dialogue they falsely assumed was entirely benign. This terrifying sequence of events does not demand that Tommaso Cioni harbors any actual guilt. It only demands that a single entity nestled within Nancy's protective bubble let their guard down, and that a calculating phantom lurking in the shadows was paying close attention. Now, let us systematically deconstruct the sheer volume of premeditated intelligence this operation demanded. The faceless silhouette that materialized upon Nancy Guthrie's threshold in the pitch-black hours of February 1st, the entity federal agents cataloged as a male operative, standing somewhere between 5'9" and 5'10", strapped with a dark 25-liter Ozark Trail rucksack, arrived executing a flawless script. He knew the exact coordinates. Nancy Guthrie was a ghost to the public eye. Her physical residence was not something you could simply pull from a digital directory. A hunter deliberately pinpointed that exact structure. Furthermore, he knew the precise hour she would be isolated and vulnerable. The extraction was executed within a razor-thin time frame, one that presented itself only after she had returned from her evening meal, locked her doors, and drifted into the heavy paralysis of deep slumber. That temporal window was not a coincidence. It was a calculated strike, He also knew the surveillance grid possessed a fatal blind spot. He did not cower from the lens. He marched straight toward the electronic eye. He firmly pressed a synthetic covered palm against the glass, utilizing the natural camouflage of a nearby shrub to plunge the device into total darkness. He perceived that specific lens as the primary obstacle to his freedom, and he arrived equipped with a tactical, physical solution to blind it. Whether he possessed intimate knowledge of her digital storage subscriptions or not, he operated under the absolute certainty that blinding the hardware was a winning strategy, strongly suggesting an insider confirmed this vulnerability to him. It is highly probable he was informed there was no off-site data vault. The miraculous retrieval of that video footage genuinely shocked the investigative team. During the tense press briefing on February 5th, Nanos admitted to the world that his tech teams had nearly abandoned all hope of salvaging the fragmented data. If the intruder's master plan hinged on the assumption that obliterating the physical hardware would permanently erase the digital memory, and he was nearly proven correct, then the mole feeding him intelligence intimately understood the localized nature of that security network. The Phantom also knew she was burdened by critical health frailties. The extortion demands directly cited her highly specific medicinal requirements. The only souls privy to that granular level of biological vulnerability resided deep within her trusted inner circle. Lastly, he knew the garage served as the ultimate threshold of confirmation. The mechanical groan of the door sealing shut between 9:48 and 9:50 at night acted as a lethal green light, a silent guarantee she was isolated inside. A predator aware this was her sole entry point would know exactly when to strike. He understood the garage was the ultimate confirmation threshold. That descending barrier between 9:48 and 9:50 at night communicated one chilling reality. She was indoors, unguarded. Anyone recognizing this as her exclusive entryway would view it as the precise moment to mobilize. To grasp the dark psychology at play, we must rewind before the fateful night of January 31st, focusing on a deeply unsettling federal probe detail that remains largely ignored. Detectives canvassing the quiet streets issued a specific directive, urging residents to comb through their security archives well before February 1st, pushing them to dig back to the first day of January 2026, an entire month prior to the vanishing. Federal authorities remained tight-lipped regarding their motives for demanding such an extensive digital backlog, yet that singular request quietly reveals the terrifying scale of premeditated reconnaissance they suspect occurred in the shadows. The eerie porch captures show a masked intruder appearing in two distinct wardrobe configurations, one featuring a rucksack and another entirely devoid of it, a chilling discrepancy driving behavioral analysts to a grim hypothesis. The Phantom had actively stalked the grounds on a minimum of 2 separate nights. Local authorities formally cautioned against jumping to conclusions, labeling such theories as premature due to the glaring absence of digital timestamps on the captures. However, the federal mandate demanding neighborhood archives from weeks prior hints at a prolonged surveillance operation spanning an entire month. Should this theory hold, we are not looking at a hastily executed abduction, but a masterclass in dark obsession cultivated over weeks. The relentless intelligence gathering, the obsessive tracking of daily routines, the mapping of digital tripwires, and the hyperfixation on her arrival schedule represented a cold, methodical, and devastatingly thorough endeavor. That caliber of calculated restraint completely rules out the haphazard gaze of a passing drifter. Such precision demands intimate access. Aligning that psychological profile with the intel held by one specific individual on January 31st at 9:50 paints a terrifying picture. Tommaso Cioni held the coordinates. He navigated the vehicle to her driveway, fully aware she was isolated indoors. He watched the door seal shut, perfectly understanding the property's digital blind spots. As a trusted insider, his unfettered entry into her private world was an established fact, alongside his acute awareness of her medical fragility. Earlier that evening, he dined with the 84-year-old matriarch, fully aware of the familial anxieties surrounding her cardiac device and daily medication. He knew she would end the night unguarded. Annie remained tucked away at home when he escorted Nancy to her doorstep. We are not accusing Tommaso Cioni of actively leaking this lethal itinerary, nor are we suggesting he consciously knew how this data might be weaponized. The sheriff fully exonerated him following his unwavering cooperation. He stood alongside Savannah and Annie at the somber memorial in early March, presenting the undeniable outward image of a heart-stricken relative drowning in loss. Yet, The federal behavioral profile pointing toward an inside job perfectly outlines an architect who wielded this precise cache of personal vulnerability. And the solitary figure standing at the absolute epicenter of that informational nexus on that specific night was Tommaso Cioni. Following the video's release, forensic experts zeroed in on a disturbing anomaly, a mysterious device protruding from the suspect's pocket, crowned by an aerial rod. This birthed two terrifying schools of thought, a wireless signal blocker or a tactical two-way radio. Coffindaffer strongly advocated for the latter. Utilizing a two-way transceiver is vastly superior to a burner phone. Apex predators know exactly the kinds of digital breadcrumbs federal cellular tracking teams can effortlessly uncover. The logic is brutally sound. Had the hardware been a frequency disruptor, both the porch lens and the victim's sensitive cardiac implant would have suffered instantaneous interference. Since neither experienced a glitch, a radio communicator introduces a terrifying new variable. This sinister plot necessitated a co-conspirator. There had to be an unseen listener anchoring the opposite end of that frequency, a ghost prowling the suburban streets earlier in the evening, a hidden lookout potentially observing the metal barrier seal shut at 9:50 at night, whispering the fatal confirmation that Nancy was isolated. Alternatively, if it was a signal jammer, the execution demanded an intimate prior understanding that her security matrix relied on wireless technology, making a signal blackout a lethally effective tactical maneuver. Whichever dark reality you subscribe to, both paths circle back to an insider. Both scenarios require a mole who deliberately handed over the blueprints to her private sanctuary. Neither interpretation allows for the comforting myth of a solitary opportunist who merely stumbled upon the property by coincidence, cruised the block a few times, and impulsively chose to unleash a nightmare upon a fragile 84-year-old grandmother. The illusion of a random attack evaporates the moment you acknowledge either tactical device. A jammer loudly declares the assailant arrived, armed with sophisticated electronic countermeasures. It proves they anticipated the digital tripwires long before stepping onto the lawn, fully aware the surveillance perimeter was formidable enough to warrant suppression. Conversely, a handheld radio screams of a heavily choreographed assault, featuring a strategically embedded accomplice feeding live tactical updates. That unseen phantom could very well have been parked in the shadows outside Annie and Tommaso's residence much earlier in the twilight hours, patiently observing the conclusion of a warm family supper, tracking the exact moment Tommaso departed with Nancy, and radioing in the chilling escalation of the plot from its initial phase into an active hunt. If a silent observer was indeed lurking in the dark that evening, meticulously documenting the end of the meal, monitoring Tommaso's vehicle reversing into the street with Nancy inside, and broadcasting a steady stream of intelligence, then the void between 9:50 at night and 1:47 in the morning takes on a profoundly more sinister, deeply calculated complexion. It stops resembling a random attack and morphs into a synchronized stakeout, holding its breath for one specific, fatal go-ahead, the driveway barrier descending right at 9:50 at night. Through the shadowy labyrinth of this ongoing inquiry, Sheriff Chris Nanos has maintained an uncharacteristically transparent and vocal stance. If you dissect his public statements with a critical eye, certain phrases immediately demand intense psychological scrutiny. During the initial phases of the inquiry, journalists press Nanos directly regarding Tommaso Cioni, prompting a highly calculated response to the Daily Mail. His exact words were that should the man be culpable, should he truly be the perpetrator, and detectives can definitively establish that fact, they will move in, but they refuse to act blindly. Notice the linguistic architecture there. It is not an outright exoneration, but rather a scenario built entirely on conditions. By structuring his answer this way, the sheriff silently validated the inquiry, treating the suspicion as credible enough to warrant a hypothetical framework instead of an absolute rejection. Furthermore, during an early March 2026 interview with NBC News, Nanos indicated authorities were zeroing in on a perpetrator, boldly claiming a personal conviction that Nancy Guthrie still draws breath. It is a staggering assertion, more than 40 days into a baffling vanishing, lacking detentions, public targets, or concrete evidence of survival. The county's top law enforcement officer maintains a steadfast belief that she is alive. He justified this optimism by hinting at a hidden reservoir of unreleased intelligence, insisting that his detectives are currently navigating a massive, confidential trove of leads. The sheriff's overarching behavioral patterns throughout this grueling ordeal invite a much deeper analysis of his strategy. After standing shoulder to shoulder with federal agents during early briefings, he abruptly pivoted his media approach, opting almost exclusively for isolated, individual sit-downs with the press. Whenever reporters attempt to pry into forensic details, he reflexively retreats behind the shield of classified operational secrecy, refusing to unveil what the task force truly knows. And when cornered about particular individuals of interest, he weaves intricate, hypothetical mazes, entirely avoiding straightforward exonerations. His carefully worded reply to the Daily Mail regarding Cioni aligns perfectly with this evasive tactic. At no point did the sheriff declare the man innocent of the crime. Instead, he offered a measured pivot, asserting that action would only follow if culpability could be undeniably established. These are the deliberate syllables of a seasoned investigator meticulously controlling the flow of public confirmation to protect his case. He possessed the opportunity to completely clear a name but consciously abstained. The true direction this steers the current manhunt remains shrouded in shadow. Yet, it undeniably signals a living, breathing hunt, a relentless pursuit still actively deciphering the grim narrative etched into the forensics. Eventually, the dam will burst, as the truth in these dark matters always surfaces. Biological material recovered from the discarded glove is already undergoing complex ancestral mapping. Detectives have also secured separate genetic traces from within the residence, harboring strong suspicions that the sample stems directly from the infiltrator. Digital footprints are being meticulously reconstructed, with analysts tearing through cellular pings bouncing off the Catalina foothills from the dark hours of January 31st. The abandoned pack, the weapon's sheath, the faint glint of a ring on the intruder's hand. Each of these subtle clues serves as a vital strand in a much larger, sinister web. Once the right thread is tugged, the entire convoluted puzzle we have analyzed will snap violently into focus. By March 9th, 2026, a haunting 37 days had passed since Nancy Guthrie vanished into the night, yielding 0 detentions, no officially named suspects, and absolute silence regarding her fate. In response to the mounting pressure, authorities mobilized a specialized elite unit designed specifically to hunt down the answers. A select cadre comprising 4 seasoned local detectives and a supervising sergeant integrated deeply into the Tucson bureau of the FBI, pouring every waking hour into this joint operation. While genetic material extracted from gloves discarded roughly 2 miles from the property led back to a neighborhood food service worker, that individual was swiftly and definitively cleared of any sinister involvement. Meanwhile, the distinct biological evidence harvested directly from the crime scene continues its journey through cutting-edge, next-generation genealogical laboratories. The sheriff has cautioned the public that deciphering this microscopic code could demand a painstaking wait of several months. Chilling surveillance footage captured at the threshold reveals the obscured phantom prowling the area in what seemingly constitutes 2 distinct stages of dress. The figure manifests both burdened by his pack and without it, birthing the terrifying theory that this predator stalked the residents on multiple, calculated reconnaissance missions. However, local authorities have forcefully emphasized the lack of digital timestamps on these recordings, dismissing any deeper public theorizing as dangerously premature. Furthermore, the mystery deepens surrounding an unknown automobile, filmed by a security lens roughly 2.5 miles from the epicenter at exactly 2:36 in the morning on February 1st. Detectives are currently attempting to isolate this phantom car from a staggering ocean of traffic, analyzing it against what Nanos described as an overwhelming volume of nocturnal commuters. Adding to the paranoia, a vandalized electrical enclosure situated mere steps from the victim's driveway has suddenly become a focal point of intense forensic scrutiny. Former federal operative Jennifer Coffindaffer categorized the manhunt not as a stagnating mystery, but as a blistering pursuit driven by nearly 100 dedicated professionals aggressively chasing down raw intelligence. Financial incentives for a breakthrough are immense, with the Federal Bureau offering $100,000, compounded by a staggering $1 million bounty posted by her desperate relatives. On the 5th of March, Savannah Guthrie bravely stepped back under the studio lights of her morning broadcast, whispering a heartbreaking vow to her peers that she remains unbroken and clinging to optimism. She declared her spirit intact, anchoring her sanity to her faith, while acknowledging that the authorities possess a structured working theory of the crime. There is a growing, chilling consensus that an architect orchestrated this nightmare, someone who handed over the victim's routines, blind spots, and the exact digital security layout. This operating theory does not dictate that the informant physically executed the snatching. Rather, it implies they simply held the keys to her private life. A singular figure's movements during the dark hours of January 30 first ominously overlap with every critical piece of insider knowledge necessary to pull off this flawless intrusion. We are not leveling formal allegations here. We are merely tracing the cold, indisputable geometry laid out by the established facts. The gravity of Nancy Guthrie's vanishing demands that we follow these breadcrumbs to their absolute limit. Share your own forensic deductions below. How do you interpret the chilling possibility of an inside job? Which glaring anomaly is this investigation desperately trying to ignore? Having walked this dark path with us, your instincts are already whispering the answers. Remember, a fortune of $1 million awaits the right voice. Do not hesitate to dial the federal authorities at 1-800-CALL-FBI if you hold the missing piece to this puzzle.